We think that blockchains are going to eat the world. We think in the next 10 years, there's going to be 10x, 100x, maybe even 1000x more tokenized assets. And what does the world look like where Microsoft is tokenizing Microsoft stock and giving it out to developers who are building on their platform,
The way that I'm thinking about it is, you have allocators, and that could be a community, that could be an algorithm, that could be some combination of algorithm and human. And then those allocators are making allocations.
I think that there's a lot of ability to realize a different part of the design space than was ever possible before. But first, you kind of have to compost the existing systems and break them down into their modular parts and understand the patterns. My goal with this pattern language work would be, first me and you, and then the podcast subscribers here understand the pattern languages of capital allocation.
Bitcoin emerged out of this kind of first principles thinking around quadratic funding and the way in which that mechanism, that algorithm, allows for the kind of weighted preferences of a collective group of people to be expressed and to use as a kind of fundamental primitive for allocating capital.
So a pattern language is a collection of common solutions to recurring problems that help people design things like building software or communities in a way that feels natural and works well. And an example of pattern language in architecture is this idea of having a light on two sides of every room. Rooms feel more pleasant and balanced when natural light comes from more than one direction. So that's an example in architecture. An example in maybe capital allocation is the voice of the governed. Welcome to the Allo.Capital podcast. If you're just joining us, we are in the summoning Allo.Capital season. Allo.Capital is a new spinout from Gitcoin that is designed to build the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. We think there's big upside here. Capital allocation is a multi-trillion-dollar design space, and VCs, governments, NGOs, and DAOs all have to allocate capital. But it's also a place where we can start small. Every time you send money to a friend or you spend money on something that you want to do, you're allocating capital. We think that as the world tokenizes over the next 10 years, there's going to be 100 or 1000x more capital that can be allocated through tokens. And we are building a through line, partnering with builders, researchers, and funders to figure out what on-chain capital allocation will look like and then building it on-chain. If you want to learn more, you can visit our website at Allo.Capital, where you can download the Allo books for free, play with some of our dApps, join the Telegram, or participate in the DAO. The episode today is about pattern languages, and Benjamin Life joins me. Benjamin Life is a co-founder and steward of Open Civics, an organization dedicated to enhancing civic engagement through participatory systems design and research. In addition to his role at Open Civics, Benjamin also contributes to research and intelligence at Allo.Capital. We are talking about pattern languages today. You can think of pattern languages as basically taking all these capital allocation mechanisms and composing them into their irreducible parts. Basically, what are the patterns in capital allocation that we can use to recompose systems in the 21st century for more democracy, more efficiency, more effectiveness than was ever possible before? So I really enjoy the subject matter of pattern language, and I think that you are going to as well. Hey, Benjamin, how are you?
GM. Yeah. Grateful to be here.
Glad to have you. So we are here to talk about pattern languages. Could you tell us what a pattern language is, and then we'll move into how it applies to on-chain capital allocation?
Yeah, so a pattern language is basically a way of describing the relationships between common challenges and solutions and the way that they relate to each other. And the body of work really originated with a guy named Christopher Alexander, who started off as an architect and was really coming out of an architectural school that was, for those who are familiar with like brutalism and kind of postmodern architecture. And if you've ever experienced brutalist architecture, it's really almost anti-human. And it was coming out of this period of design thinking that was really influenced by kind of postmodernism and Marxism, that was really responding to this idea that there was kind of an ideal, perfect architectural form, and this idea that that idea of perfection, of kind of perfectly sculpted gardens and kind of ideal forms of human relationships to space, that was bad and oppressive. And so we need to create this kind of blank slate that would allow like the spark of the human soul to come forward. And Alexander was taught in that architectural school, and he started to see that actually, this way of thinking about architecture didn't actually support the flourishing of the human soul. It actually created, more limitations because of its abstraction and its oversimplification of how human beings interacted. And so the pattern language work really came out of this idea that architecture should move, the form of architecture should move from the function of creating health and well-being. And so he created this idea of a pattern language, which is really how these fundamental units within an architectural structure could support human flourishing and well-being, and that those architectural primitives, to use kind of more of a Web3 term, could be combined in novel ways depending on the environment. And so it was a different way of thinking about design that was more focused on empiricism, more focused on the design characteristics that create a thriving system, and how those component parts, work together to create higher quality of life for human beings, and better relationship with the natural world. And shortly after he created this architectural design school, he realized that this actually could be applied to software. And so there's this really strong connection between, architecture of space and architecture of software engineering. And so that, body of work has been really inspiring to me. And so as we started to get into, this idea of really creating a new design space for capital allocation, I immediately went back to Alexander's work to look at how this idea of pattern languages could be applied to the software that we create to allocate capital. And it's very simple and yet very powerful,
Mm.
because it allows us to look at these kind of fundamental units of design and how they relate to each other. And what makes it a language is that you can compose these underlying patterns into new types of mechanism or design. And so in the same way that, he applied it to architecture and then Web 2 software, I feel like this kind of underlying meta pattern of, how patterns relate to each other and how they form a system together, is really essential for us to create this new design space around capital allocation that makes it accessible to non-technical people. That was one of the big things that Alexander was trying to achieve with pattern language in the architectural context, was these are kind of first principles ways of thinking about design that, once you have articulated them in a language, then allows everyday people to start speaking that language in the creation of new frameworks, structures and software.
Thanks. I'm going to play that back just so that the audience can hear it in two different form factors. So, a pattern language is a collection of common solutions to recurring problems that help people design things like building software or communities in a way that feels natural and works well. So, an example of pattern language in architecture is this idea of having a light on two sides of every room. Rooms feel more pleasant and balanced when natural light comes from more than one direction. So that's an example in architecture. An example in maybe capital allocation is the voice of the governed. So basically, a system that allocates capital according to what the everyday constituents in that community will feel more legitimate than something where you have like a technocratic elite. Generally, that's a pattern language for democracy in capital allocation. So as I play that back, any reactions to that? Is that too reductionist?
No, I think that's the appropriate level of simplicity, because this is actually trying to take something that's really vast and complex and distill it down into its kind of base level patterns. And a big component of this design philosophy is rooted in empiricism. So things that are actually happening. What are, from a first principles perspective, how can we look at the dynamics that are already present within a system and help to distill them down into their components so they can be reconfigured? And I think it's really cool and beautiful in a way that, Gitcoin emerged out of this kind of first principles thinking around quadratic funding, and the way in which that mechanism, that algorithm, allows for the kind of weighted preferences of a collective group of people to be expressed and to use as a kind of fundamental primitive for allocating capital. And to see that evolution from Gitcoin and going multi-mechanism, and now we're in this much more pluralistic and open-ended design space. I think Gitcoin as an example of kind of one of these essential primitives. Now we're looking at, a much more open-ended design space that takes, the affordances of that, original pattern of quadratic funding, and starts to see how they can stack and interact with other patterns in the form of new mechanisms.
Yeah. What I love about this design space is how vast and broad it is. But the part of trying to distill these different mechanisms and ideas into their discrete parts, it just mirrors a lot of the ways that I was taught to think in terms of software where you have composability and modularity. And so if we can break down different ways of building political economies into their composite parts, then we can kind of build modules that allow builders to recompose them in new configurations that we've never dreamed of before. And especially now that we've got crypto and especially AI, I think that there's a lot of ability to realize a different part of the design space than was ever possible before. But first, you kind of have to compost the existing systems and break them down into their modular parts and understand the patterns that are there. And then you can kind of build a toolkit that people can recompose new types of systems that are hopefully better. And we hope that they're better, but I think that we're really just scratching the surface at this point. So my goal with this pattern language work would be, first me and you, and then the podcast subscribers here understand the pattern languages of capital allocation. And then once we do that, we can kind of build a groundswell of support for builders in building better on-chain capital allocation tools. And there's just so much here because I think that we're just starting to scratch the surface of what's possible in this design space.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to go into, some of the thinking that we've started to collate, and this is really intended to open up a conversation around, how do we distill these discrete components. I think one of the beautiful things about Web3 is that it can be modular by its very nature. And so the positive sum feedback loops that we can start to see once we have these distinct primitives and are able to start stacking them together, there's a combinatorial explosion of possibility that, we wouldn't have access to if we didn't have modular software that we could build on top of. This is intended to begin that conversation around how can we look at the kind of patterns that are at the core of these different mechanisms, and start to, distinguish between how is decision making made. Is it, through weighted preference? Is it through conviction voting? What are the signals that we're taking in from either a community, or from like on-chain data, or from like market pricing, and conform those signals into outputs. So that's one area of like how are allocators expressing their preferences. And this can be communities or institutions, or some mix of algorithmic decision making and human decision making. And because we're able to take those different components and look at them side by side, we can say, oh, in this context, it might be more appropriate for decisions to be made purely algorithmically, or here's where we need humans in the loop, and here's the kind of signaling mechanism that we want to provide to this community to provide input into the decision around how funds are allocated. And so, within the domain of capital allocators, we can look at them as communities or institutions or algorithms or markets. And those are kind of the distinct units that I'm starting to see as, who are the allocators making these allocation decisions, and then trying to break down the allocations themselves. Are these, proactive funds that are being allocated before work is taking place? Or is this more of an ongoing drip of continuous funding based on some kind of input of signals, whether that's, on-chain reputation or bounties? Or is this retroactive? Is this happening based on attestations like hypercerts or retro PGF, for example? And then, are these investments like are you allocating with the hope of recouping that? What are the mechanisms that allow you to get that back, like a RevNet or like dependency funding, where you're making an allocation decision to predict some outcome that you hope to recoup some benefit from? And then, are those signals that you're using to make those decisions based on reputation or, on-chain claims or some kind of performance indicator? Are these like conditional allocations that are happening based on certain triggers within the system? So those are the kind of, underlying mechanisms, uh, components that I would love to work with the Allo community to start to get a little bit more granular and define in terms of how we're describing them, so that we can have a shared language. Because this is really only effective once we start to have, larger groups of people using the same language to compose mechanisms. So this isn't something that can be designed in a vacuum. This has to be done, through the community itself.
So, I mean, I think that there's such a rich design space here, but for me as podcast host, I think that what is most alive is sort of painting a cartography of the design space so that people can visualize in their mind's eye the different directions that this conversation could go and orient themselves in it. I think that what sort of feels alive for me is that there's this really big design space, and we're talking about sort of abstract concepts, on-chain capital allocation, and in that sense, having a shared understanding that there's different contexts in which we need different languages to apply in different contexts is important. So I'm looking at your post on research.allo.capital about capital allocation pattern language, and that's linked in the show notes if anyone wants to check it out and consume this information in written form. But it feels like there's domains of decision making, membership thresholds. How do you do sense making and signal generation? How do you do learning and knowledge management in these systems? How do you do culture? If you could give us just like a high level topology of what are the different domains that we could spelunk into, I think that that would help the listener feel oriented in this design space.
Yeah, I definitely like speed ran through a bunch of them, but I would go back to kind of the top level because I think the simpler we can make this, the easier it'll be for more people to jump in and contribute. So the way that I'm thinking about it is, you have allocators, and that could be a community, that could be an algorithm, that could be some combination of algorithm and human. And then those allocators are making allocations. And those allocations are, either a one-time event, which is either predicting something in the future or compensating for something in the past, or it's some kind of ongoing, continuous funding based on a particular signal that's being inputted into the system. And then that allocation, could be, there's different types of liquidity or capital that are being allocated. So, having some kind of categorization of the type of capital that's being allocated. And then the last top level category to me are the signals. And those signals, can either be, retroactive as well, like how have you performed in the past, which could determine future allocations. It could be based on, particular metrics or claims. So, we're exchanging capital for a particular claim that's being made, like a hypercert, or some combination of qualitative and quantitative assessment. And then, perhaps if we're looking at a feedback loop where, our allocation decisions are not just happening one time, but they're happening ongoing, then we're also going to look at those output signals. I think one of the really great primitives that has come out of the Gitcoin ecosystem is Karma Gap, which really emerged because there needed to be accountability between rounds of how projects were performing, because we started to realize as a community that if you allocate to a particular grantee over and over again, but you don't have on-chain verification of the work that they're doing, that's going to affect the allocation decisions that you make in the future. And so Karma Gap, built on top of Ethereum attestation service, provides that kind of accountability output signal. What did you do with the capital that was allocated, so that when we get into the next round of allocations, we're making decisions based on the output signals from the last time we allocated capital. And so ideally those signals function as a feedback loop where, we're you taking some signals in to determine our allocation, and those signals can either be, looking into the future or based on looking into the past. That's the top level kind of ontology that I'm seeing, but um, I'm I'm open to picking different levels of abstraction depending on, what specific problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah. And one of the things that I want to sort of note here is that there's been multiple researchers that have independently converged on this idea that we need a pattern language for capital allocation. So I just had Ori from Mechanism Institute on the podcast, and he was talking about his top level taxonomy of different ways that we use capital allocation to make decisions, to allocate resources, to do rewards and penalties, to define memberships, to manage knowledge. And that was his top level taxonomy. That's season 1, episode 5 of the Allo.Capital podcast, if listeners want to listen to that. And then you and I were at Funding the Commons in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, and independently, Jeff Emmett from Block Science and Raymond Chang from Open Source Observer kind of stirred up this conversation about what could we do with a pattern language of on-chain capital allocation if we actually were to marry that pattern language with the mechanisms of the different composite irreducible parts with the mechanisms they're used in. So QF, retro funding, direct grants. And then we were to marry that with the actual data of Open Source Observer has all this data about who's actually allocating capital out there. And so we could build this data warehouse that has all of the intelligence of all the different pattern language Legos and where they're being used and how much money is flowing into them. And it just felt like we had this convergence of many people who are independently deciding that this design space was important to build. And I'm just really excited about having a series here on the podcast and around Allo.Capital where we can explore this design space and hopefully distill it into things that mechanism designers and builders can actually use. So I'm going to put that intent out there into the universe by saying it on the podcast. That Benjamin, I think you've been doing some great work here, but it's about creating a Schelling point where many different intelligences can come together, and they might have different taxonomies. We should figure out how we agree on which taxonomies are the highest level and approach it in an iterative and constructive fashion. But there's many smart people working on this, and I think that you're one of the people in the frontier.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And as you said, these tools and frameworks are, only really as useful as they are, empirical. Like they're describing something real about reality and not just something that we've made up as a cool framework. And then that empiricism should then create kind of a evolutionary fitness landscape where the framework that's most descriptive about reality of what's actually happening should hopefully rise to the top. And it's only through these interactions between people who are thinking deeply about these things that we can start to hash out, what the most descriptive and appropriate taxonomy is. But then once we have a kind of shared reality or Schelling point where we converge around a shared understanding of how we're describing these mechanisms, as you said, we have all of this on-chain data that we can actually start to correlate to different composites of mechanisms, and then we can actually bring more of a scientific method to this mechanism design process where we're not creating cool mechanisms for their own sake, but because they have particular outcomes. Like you mentioned in the very beginning, having natural light from two sides, that's an empirical observation that human beings tend to perform better when they have this characteristic of design in the space that they occupy. And so if we're able to take that same kind of utility that this pattern language provides and apply it to mechanism design, we can actually start to see like, oh, when you have this combination of conviction voting and tunable QF with these criteria for how we're vetting, who has boosted signal and who doesn't, then we can get these particular outcomes, which could, be total value locked, or it could be, how many new users this particular software brought into an ecosystem. And, I think a lot of ecosystems have been using public goods funding as a marketing strategy or development strategy, without that degree of scientific method and empiricism around how these individual mechanisms are creating the kinds of outcomes that they're looking to achieve. And so I think the more granular we can be around correlating particular mechanism components with particular outcomes, and then start iteratively testing and A/B testing, how does adding this way of modifying decision making authority within this signal of allocation create better outcomes or more desirable outcomes for those ecosystems, and have it really be more like a field of design science that then, a kind of tinkering with different mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the goals that we have with Allo.Capital is to take this out of just sort of like I don't want to sound too pejorative, but sometimes with mechanism design, it can kind of feel like masturbation of just like it's just cool ideas that we're sharing. What are the different ways that we could combine AI and crypto together into these cybernetic systems? But what we're trying to do here is ground it in what's actually going to be empirically useful to people who are allocating capital in the year 2025 or 2030 if we want to skate to where the puck is going. And one of the things that I really like about the piece that you published on research.allo.capital, which again is linked in the show notes if listeners want to get it, is one of the things I really like about it is how it's anchored into the audience of who are like the people who are going to be allocating capital in the tokenized internet. And so your paper talks about DAO-based capital allocators. It talks about family offices. It talks about governments and NGOs. And I think that that grounding of what's going to be empirically useful is super important. And I think that that's a service that we can provide to the mechanism designers out there is the grounding in audiences that are actually going to be using this software. And I wonder if we can sort of steer that conversation towards those audiences and what are the most exciting and most alive patterns that you see developing as we're building the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet.
Yeah, I'm really happy that Allo is taking this kind of broad stance around capital allocation, because I didn't get into Web3 to build DeFi protocols. I respect that, the degens and the regens have a very ideally symbiotic relationship with each other. But I get the sense that we have started in this particular context because this is where there was market demand. And I think that was great for bootstrapping an industry. And I also think that it's not the end state that I personally have in mind for Web3, in that I think part of our mission generally as an industry has to be expanding beyond DeFi into real world assets and, pension funds and governments who all have capital allocation challenges and that Web3 could directly solve. And yet we're not really reaching those audiences because we don't bring the kind of academic rigor to the work that we're doing, or we're only speaking to a particular audience that already knows what we're talking about. And that hopefully, if we can start to describe these mechanisms outside of a purely, DeFi context, and start looking at other metrics that other types of ecosystems that aren't currently on chain are really interested in, then we can actually bring whole new categories of capital on chain and expand our industry beyond DeFi. And so, one of the mechanisms that I'm personally really excited about is really expanding on-chain attestations. I think big challenge that governments and nonprofits face all around the world is correlating capital allocation to impact. And that's a huge problem to solve. And there's many people, like the hypercerts example, I think is they're very far along in their thinking in terms of, how these new kinds of asset classes can be created. But having, attestation mechanisms that allow capital allocators to remove some of the bureaucratic overhead, because a lot of times the way that these allocations happen in TradFi and the non-blockchain world of impact funding, is you have to hire all of these intermediary bureaucratic agencies that oftentimes suck up a great majority of the total capital that's being allocated just to do the project oversight and verification. And so if we're able to use, distributed networks of validators that are checking the impact of particular forms of capital allocation and removing some of that bureaucracy, I think we could, make that pitch to governments to say you can bring your costs down and increase the impact that you're creating because you've removed the middleman of impact verification. It's a very difficult problem to solve. But I think that that's the kind of scale that we need to be thinking about in order to really expand from DeFi into, this much vaster world of impact funding. And then from there we can go further into how pension funds are allocating their capital and how family offices are allocating their capital or hedge funds. There's a ton of different domains that we haven't really touched as an industry because we haven't been thinking about these mechanisms in the kind of academic rigor that's required to bring new categories on chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're really touching on our theory of change with Allo.Capital, which is basically that we think that blockchains are going to eat the world. We think in the next 10 years, there's going to be 10x, 100x, maybe even 1,000x more tokenized assets. And what does the world look like where Microsoft is tokenizing Microsoft stock and giving it out to developers who are building on their platform, like real Web3 ways of doing things. And I think to me, there's like two distinct meta categories of capital allocators. There's the audience now, which is basically DAO capital allocators, the kind of people who would be doing things like quadratic funding and retroactive funding. And then there's people that are like family offices or like JP Morgan or governments or an NGO that is allocating capital in like a very trad way and has a very like trad culture associated with it. And I think that we think that as blockchains eat the world and there's generational change, that there's going to be a shift in how that second group is allocating capital. And there's going to be sort of like a confluence of culture and technology wherein we can do more democratic, efficient capital allocation experiments. And another part of this theory of change is that as we move from hierarchies, the dominant mode of organization in the 20th century in the industrial age was hierarchy, to more networked ways of knowing where we've got all these IoT sensors and everyone is online. We can build more network ways of working. And there's going to be more based ways of doing resource allocation. Things like quadratic funding, I think, is an early example of that. And we're going to be able to cut out all of the administrative overhead and provide 10x more effectiveness and efficiency, because there's going to be so many sensor networks out there about the state of the world that you can like sort of like create this sense and respond network that's able to respond in a network based way. And so what I think of the pattern language work as doing is sort of like breaking down both systems into their composite parts and building a bridge. And hopefully we'll reach escape velocity and build the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. That's, I think, the vision here. And I think that the work that we're doing with pattern language, or more specifically you and Ori and others are doing, is kind of building a bridge between those two worlds by breaking them down into their composite parts. We can build a bridge between the old culture and the new culture and start to actually present ourselves as legitimate to that world of NGOs who maybe just had their funding cut by Doge, or family offices that want to have an impact in their community because they're worried about their legacy of their family. And I think that there's going to be so much great ways that capital can make an impact in a positive way in the 21st century, at the other end of that. So that's my theory of change. Just wanted to give you a space to react to that and the usefulness of pattern language in that world.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us got into this space because we saw the intrinsic power of decentralization and the benefit that that could have to humanity. And I don't know that that value is necessarily been advanced very much in the last however many, 10 years or so of this industry's existence. And in the sense that, I think we do ourselves any favors with, people like FTX becoming the big news story that it was. And we haven't had very many professional, grounded, scientific, empirically backed qualitative and quantitative research that shows the benefits of decentralization. A lot of it has been, the potential for scams. I saw you post a great meme the other day of like, we trust me, this is not a scam, not at least not some small portion of it. I don't remember exactly what the meme
I
was,
think it
but
was like Web3 is not all a scam, just most of it. That was the idea, and I have 4,000 likes on that. I was like, "Whoops, didn't mean to blow that up."
Yeah, and so I think that really speaks to the need for us as an industry to bring this quality of research and empiricism to really make that value more legible to traditional capital allocation as a domain. And so I think that's why I think Allo is right over the target in the sense that this is really the domain in which we really need to demonstrate our legitimacy to these traditional institutions to say, this is not about pump and dump. This is about increasing the efficiency of the correlation between the decisions you're making around how you're moving capital through the system and the outcomes that you want to see more of in the world. And those outcomes can be like return on investment or impact on investment. But to be able to show empirically that these mechanisms actually improve the efficiency of what matters to you, whether that's returns or impact, and to be able to show that through these patterns that make that value more legible to these traditional institutions.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of threads to pull here. I mean, I'm excited about building more positive sum crypto ecosystem. I think that positive sum games have evolved many times in nature, and I think that the work that we're doing with Allo.Capital is going to explore different ways that crypto can be positive sum and push us away from the PvP sort of like scammy reputation that crypto had in its inception. And I kind of think of we're in the phase of nature where we're just in this primordial soup and we're just at the very tip of agents in this ecosystem starting to learn that there's evolutionary returns, there's fitness gains to be had on positive sum games. And in order to justify the complexity of multicellular or multi-organism coordination, we have to get over this hump where it's hard to do and it just becomes common knowledge to together in a positive some way. And I think of the pattern language stuff as making it easier to build these mechanisms and hopefully more effective. So that's how it all connects for me. But as we're in the last 5 minutes of the episode, I'm wondering if there's anything that I didn't ask that you want to say, Benjamin, and what feels alive for you as we're closing out this conversation.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the evolutionary nature of the work that we're doing because there's some really strong corollaries in nature, in our deep history that I think are important to understand in order to look at how non-rivalrous, additive positive sum games actually occur in the natural world. And one of the examples that I love is if you look back far enough in the evolutionary tree, you see this split between bacteria and other multicellular organisms. And basically, the tree that emerges from bacteria is kind of a dead end. Over, some hundreds of millions of years, bacteria didn't become complex multicellular organisms. They just kind of kept exploring the bacteria part of the evolutionary tree. And what created that distinction was the introduction of mitochondria into the evolutionary process, where basically these cells merged in a way that allowed for the benefits of mitochondria, which is really about energy production and the efficiency allocating energy and producing energy from the raw inputs of other nutrients into cells that were doing other things. And basically the difference between the bacteria and the cells that merged with the mitochondria is that the cells that merged with mitochondria had enough energy to encode an additional segment of DNA, which was not a ton of extra DNA, but that small amount of genetic information allowed for a vast flourishing of many different expressions of organisms, which now we can see as trees and grasses and whales and bears and insects. And that whole spectrum of organism emerged because of a small section of DNA that the mitochondria allowed for cells to process, because it takes energy to encode genetic information. And so I think if we look at genetic information as itself a pattern language, it's actually a very simple set of patterns. And yet you can stack those patterns into all of those different types of organisms. And so, without making too many jumps or mixing metaphors here, I think if we look at crypto as a kind of mitochondria that allows us to encode new information through smart contracts that expands our expressive capacity of the kinds of organizations we can create, the kinds of incentives that we can modify and design, there's a whole new set of expressive capacities that we gain in terms of the kinds of organizations we can build, the kinds of systems we can design. And that unlocks this entirely new evolutionary fitness landscape of different types of forms of human society. And so I think that's the kind of evolutionary phase change that we're in. Is, this one branch of human society is like bacteria that has a limited expression of forms that it can take. And then once we supercharge things with composable smart contracts and modular software design, we suddenly have this entirely new evolutionary landscape that we can explore. So without getting too nerdy, I think that's kind of the evolutionary moment that we're in. And I don't want to oversell that, but I do think that that is the moment that we're in, and the scope and scale of change that's possible by learning how to encode these patterns into new expressions of human society.
What I love there is that this isn't just work that we're doing for good or for charity. We're doing it because we see a phase shift where crypto is going to go from PvP zero sum games to positive sum games. And I think that we want to ease that transition and accelerate that transition. And one of the ways of doing that is building a pattern language for different positive sum games that communities can come together, fund their infrastructure, fund their public goods, allocate capital to the right things. And, I think that creating that phase transition is sort of what's in my vision. And I think that we're gonna do it not because it's charitable, but because it's the meta. It's the next evolutionary meta. And that's what becomes really exciting to me. Do you think that positive sum games are a pattern language that we want to pursue, similar to how we started off the episode talking about architecture and having light coming from two different sources in the room creates a better room to live in? Do you think positive sum games are going to be a competitive advantage, and that's a pattern language that we want to build?
Yeah, I don't think it's any accident that Moloch figures so predominantly in our kind of collective mythology. I think that if we look at coordination failures as a design space, and we don't see them as intrinsic to human nature, but as things that we can actually design to remove from how our society is organized, that gives me a lot of hope because, there's a lot of kumbaya, there's a lot of, abundance mentality, and I don't think that those are going to get us there. But I think that having a scientific approach to how we're designing systems and designing rivalry and scarcity out of the system through empiricism and the way that we design our systems, that I think is doable. And, Buckminster Fuller believed it was possible back in the 1960s when he was writing. And we've only increased our ability and sophistication of mechanism design and system architecture since then. And so I think as a design space, this is protopian. It's not, because we want to wave our hands and imagine a better world. It's that we actually want to design that world from the ground up. And a pattern language is really our ability to describe the underlying characteristics and conditions of the systems and structures that are going to get us there. And so that's where we have to start. That's not where we end up. But, imagining just an additional sequence of DNA could create all of this abundance and all of these positive, like you look at the Amazon rainforest and yes, there's competition in that system, but overall, it's the positive sum relationships between all of those parts of an ecology that create the abundance that we see. And those are knowable components that we can actually wrap our heads around. And the complexity that emerges from just those simple components, I think, is a way for us to engineer scarcity out of our world.
Thanks, Benjamin. Well, I think that that's all the time that we have, and so I've got to move towards wrapping us up in the episode. I think that pattern languages are going to be increasingly important over the next couple of years, and excited to explore the body of work that you and others are creating in and around Allo.Capital. If the listener wants to do that, they can follow you on Twitter. The link to your Twitter is in the show notes. There's also a link to the research post that you have authored, a capital allocation pattern language and allocator archetypes. So would encourage the listener, if they want to get involved in this body of work, to show up on the research forum and express an interest in adding some value here. Anything to say as we're winding up, Benjamin?
Just that I'm really looking forward to having conversations with people smarter than I am about this, because it really is going to take all of us coming together to define these primitives to be able to start building things together that are more modular, more interoperable, and that start to see that kind of combinatorial explosion that is, I think, necessary for us to grow our industry from the small slice of the pie of what's currently on chain to a world that is entirely based in on chain mechanisms.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, we are going to be working to create a groundswell of technological and social capital that is focused on this. At least until we run out of money, we're going to be creating that groundswell. So excited to be working with you, Benjamin, and all the other smart people that are working on this. For the listener, check out Benjamin's research post, which is linked in the show notes, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thanks, Kevin.
You just heard from Benjamin Life on the subject of pattern language. I'm really excited about pattern language because I think that there is going to be a lot of really great intelligence capital that we're able to produce in the Allo ecosystem of pattern languages of capital allocation. I think it's going to accelerate the transition to more positive sum games in the 21st century. Thanks for listening to the Allo.Capital podcast. This podcast features the people who are building the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. Disclaimer: this podcast is for informative purposes only and is not financial advice. Do your own research. Do not make any financial decisions based off of these episodes. In addition, disclosure: I own crypto assets like ETH, DAI, USDC, and GTC. Thanks, Benjamin, for coming on this episode. I think it was really fun. Excited to explore the design space of on chain capital allocation and pattern language with you and other smart people out there. Peace and love. I will see you next time. Goodbye.